Welcome to our first meeting of the Energy Policy Seminar for the spring semester. I'm Joe Alding. I will serve as the host for today's seminar. As usual, we are operating in a hybrid format, both for the audience here in the room and for our friends, colleagues, and alumni who are joining us over Zoom. Before we get started, a few notes of thanks. First, thanks to the Belfer Center, to the Mosvar Rachmani Center for Business and Government, and to the Salata Institute for their support of the seminar series. Especially enthusiastic thanks for all the work that Liz and Ricardo do to help make the seminar go smoothly. Thank you all very much. And thank you all for joining us here today as we get started for what I think is going to be a lively set of talks over the course of the spring semester. We're thrilled to kick off the seminar series this semester with a talk from Jeremy Harrell. Jeremy is the CEO of ClearPath and ClearPath Action, DC-based conservative clean energy organizations advancing policies that accelerate innovation to reduce global energy-related emissions. He sits on the board of directors of the U.S. Nuclear Industry Council and the Ohio-based clean energy incubator BRIGHT. He also serves on the Energy Advisory Committee for the Bipartisan Policy Center. He's testified before the U.S. Congress, state legislatures, state public utility commissions on energy innovation, export financing, and regulatory modernization. Before joining ClearPath, Jeremy advised Republican congressional leaders on energy, environmental, tax, national security, and transportation policy. Jeremy will make some initial remarks. Then we're going to sit down here and have a little bit of a fireside chat, and then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. Jeremy, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Harvard, for hosting me today. It's an honor to be here with you all, and I'm really excited to talk about the potential for bipartisan energy policy over the coming decade. As Joe mentioned, my name is Jeremy Harrell. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of ClearPath. ClearPath is a DC-based conservative clean energy organization. And our mission is to accelerate technological innovations to reduce global energy emissions. We work in three sectors of the economy: the power sector, heavy industry, and ag sector. And we're looking to drive down the cost of clean energy and climate tech solutions. So that's everything from scaling up new advanced nuclear reactor designs and enhanced geothermal systems to how do we produce building blocks of the global economy like cement, steel, and fertilizer in both an affordable and lower carbon way. I've been at ClearPath a little more than 8 years. And before that, as Joe mentioned, I worked on Capitol Hill advising Republican policymakers on energy, transportation, and natural resources related issues. And I'll admit, I came into climate, I kind of fell into climate. When I came to Washington, D.C. almost 20 years ago, much like a lot of folks, I wanted to work on foreign policy, foreign affairs, potentially be a foreign service officer. And energy environment found me. I was always concerned about climate. I was interested in clean energy and new technology, that it was a no-brainer that we needed affordable, reliable, and lower emitting technologies. And we saw a big white space in this realm where the debate in Washington, D.C. had been centered on 100% renewables or drill, baby, drill. And there is a lot more of our energy policy and economic policy that falls within those. And I came to ClearPath after 10 years of government service to find ways to catalyze bipartisan policy action in this space. So I thought it might be helpful just to kind of underscore ClearPath's mission and vision here, because it really informs how we focus on U.S. federal policy. So ClearPath, a unique nonprofit organization. So we're philanthropically funded, but industry informed. So what does that mean? We work with innovators, with entrepreneurs to identify barriers to the scale up of energy and advanced manufacturing technologies, and then try to do both small and big policy solutions that can help enable them and accelerate the scale up. But we think about climate from a global perspective. Climate is a global challenge facing the global population. And our view is that the United States is going to lead both as an early actor as well as a technology provider of affordable, low-carbon solutions. And so as we think about the policy suite, we are driving forward on policy everywhere from basic research and development to bring technologies and ideas from the labs to the commercial marketplace, to how do we initially prove those technologies as commercially viable? How do we set up regulatory regimes that allow us to scale them quickly here at home, build here at home? And then how does the US promote those technologies abroad so that it can impact the global emissions picture? Over my time in DC, almost 20 years now, I've worked really closely not only with federal policymakers, but with key industry stakeholders across those sectors of the economy. Because in the end, our belief is public sector resources and federal policy have an important role to play in driving these technologies forward, but we need to be able to unlock immense private sector capital to invest not only here in the United States, but abroad. I've been tapped in both Republican and Democratic administrations for federal advisory committees related to clean energy. And we manage a roughly 40-person team in Washington, D.C. That's broken down within those sectors that I mentioned: power sector, heavy industry, and ag. Government affairs professionals that are doing direct lobbying and maker education in D.C., both Congress and the executive branch. We do strategic communications and polling. And we drive forward on political activities and campaigns to get policy across the finish line. So the oversimplification: we come to policymakers with ideas, the data on why to do it. We come to them with polling and message testing to help them communicate that back home in their districts here in the US and back in DC, and show them how there's a political advantage to it. We build bipartisan coalitions to drive those policies forward, and we run campaigns to ultimately get across the finish line. So soup to nuts, policy development to driving forward, and we work with really critical folks in academia and in industry to ensure that we're driving forward policies that unlock that federal policy action. And why we care. In the end, our mission is to reduce global energy emissions. And it is our view that we have to decouple economic growth from the emissions trajectory of the globe. And so it's how do we make technologies cheaper so that we are not putting forth a false choice or making folks have to work outside of their immediate economic interest for a longer term goal. And, as we drive forward, particularly in the power sector, there's a really unique moment here with rising demand that can really help increase the appetite for financing new innovative technologies, things like advanced nuclear, like long duration energy storage, like carbon capture, and ultimately help grow our manufacturing and supply chains here in the US and foster global economic prosperity. In the end, we're highly skeptical of a lower carbon future that is reliant on the global consumer making sacrifices. In the end, we want to drive down the cost of the lower emitting options, and so that we're unlocking private sector and market behavior and driving a commercial scale up that leads to those deep decarbonization areas. So as we think about technologies or in the sectors, it's about how we get on that emissions and technology curve to drive both domestic leadership here in the US, but also in global emissions. And so how we go and talk to policymakers on Capitol Hill. So as I mentioned, we're a conservative clean energy organization. And often people will go, well, how's that going in DC? And I would say a lot of success over the last decade and a lot of opportunity to move it forward. We're oriented around trying to reduce emissions, but it's how do we do that with US leadership? And so it's innovate here and innovate quickly. It's build it here in the US and how we and then selling it globally. And we work across all these technology areas and sector specific areas with experts in the field and within industry to devise policy solutions, not only that are sector specific to these sectors, but also to really scale up these techs that we think are likely going to be essential to driving down global emission pictures. And so to get to a little bit of the intro of or the title of this seminar, I would say that I don't want to come off as Pollyannish because no doubt we are in a tumultuous political period. I would say that trust and dysfunction within government is at all-time high. I think we're seeing that very directly here this week as we're potentially about to embark on at least a partial government shutdown for the second time in the last 4 months. And there is some significant consensus around technology, clean energy, and American competitiveness. And we've seen that come out really over the last 6 years. You may be familiar with a few of these bills, like the Inflation Reduction Act and then what is called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the Republican Reconciliation Bill that was passed last July. But there's really been this kind of bucket of big policy that has all led us to this moment over the last six to 8 years. The Energy Act of 2020, probably the one that you haven't heard of, was signed into law right at the end of the first Trump administration. And at this time, it was actually the single largest climate bill enacted into law since 2007, when at the end of the Bush administration, a bipartisan package was done with a Democratic controlled Congress and President Bush to put a bunch of new incentives and carrot policies around clean energy. And the Energy Act of 2020 was really important because it laid out the foundation of innovation policy in really key technology areas that not just the US, but the International Energy Agency has said are critical to tackling a lower carbon future. IEA has done projection of 50 plus technologies that the US or that the globe is going to need to reach deep decarbonization. And only 4 of those technologies are in the wide scale commercial deployment realm. And so the Energy Act had targeted bills that were aimed at bringing new advanced nuclear technologies to the market, multiple new long duration energy storage research, development, and demonstration programs to bring long duration storage to the commercial marketplace. The first real big investment in new geothermal, as we see a technology that has played a major role in the West in providing low carbon, affordable technology, but had not seen really commercial tick up outside of a few key states like Nevada, Utah, and California. And a big focus on manufacturing and heavy industry, an area that, frankly, a lot of policy had not really been moved forward in a bipartisan way years. It also included a significant phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, a long-standing priority of both parties to treaty forward and really drive forward this significant greenhouse gas emission. It put major incentives behind energy efficiency policy. And this, again, was a big bipartisan deal, got almost 300 plus votes in the US House and more than 70 votes in the US Senate right at the end of the Trump administration. And President Trump signed it into law. Move into the Biden administration, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the big bipartisan infrastructure bill, multi-billion-dollar investments in US infrastructure. And the energy portion of that bill, which ended up being the single largest direct investment in US applied energy in our history, would not have been happened without this Energy Act of 2020. This kind of did the blueprint for where we should be investing public and private dollars into technology. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act infused $62 billion into the Department of Energy to pre-fund many of these big programs. So, for example, something like the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program, a reactor demo program to commercially demonstrate this next generation of small modular reactor and advanced reactors. The Energy Act of 2020 authorized it. Congress put some initial couple $100 million behind it. At the end of the Trump administration, going into the Biden administration, some leading designs got selected for multi-billion-dollar cost share programs. And then the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act pre-funded multiple billions to bring these technologies forward. And so now we have, for example, 2 exciting advanced nuclear technologies, TerraPower's reactor in Kemmer, Wyoming, and X-Energy's high-temperature gas reactor in Seadrift, Texas. They're all on track to be placed in service by the end of this decade. And we saw that in a bunch of other different technology areas. You saw a big investment in enhancement of the DOE loan guarantee program, injection in infrastructure programs, into electric vehicle infrastructure, into CO2 pipelines, into hydrogen-focused initiatives. And so the $62 billion, again, the single largest one-time investment of applied RD&D dollars into the US government in our history. Naturally, towards as the Biden administration progressed and Democrats took control of Congress, we saw the first partisan version of these, which was the Inflation Reduction Act. You probably have read a lot about the news on that, but a significant establishment of long-term tax incentives put in place into the early 2030s. And that was like a major change. So when I was on Capitol Hill, I worked for a Senate Finance Republican member, and we were fighting over 1 year, 2 year extensions of tax credits for, frankly, a decade. So I worked for Dean Heller, who was a Nevada senator, and he was the lead Republican in the extension of the solar investment tax credit back in 2013. And we were doing a year back date and then a slow 3 or 4 year phase down of solar at that stage. You saw a big investment in fuels. You saw an investment in American manufacturing competitiveness. And then you saw many of those resources started to get deployed through the back end of the Biden administration. And then we've got the one big beautiful bill. So this was the Republican tax package that was passed back in July. And you saw a scale back of many of these policies from the IRA, but many also left in place. And so, for example, there is a investment tax credit in place for technologies like advanced nuclear, geothermal, long duration energy storage, and hydropower still into the 2030s. So when you think about a baseline, right? If you think pre-IRA in 2022, we were fighting over this tax 1 year, 2 year extensions, backdates that really weren't driving private sector action, right? Investors don't make big bets when you have that type of uncertainty. And certainly, would we have wanted more of the tax incentives put in place and carrots put in place back in 2022 left in place? Absolutely. But you still see some of these big tax credits now blessed by a Republican and a Democratic majority in Congress staying forward. And we're already seeing investors respond accordingly. There's more confidence now that because a full Democrat-controlled government and a full Republican-controlled government have blessed the remaining tax credits in place, that these are going to be here into the 2030s, and investors have strong confidence they'll be there and they can drive private sector investment. Incentives to drive manufacturing, the 45X tax credit, which was oriented on onshoring more solar production, critical minerals manufacturing, wind turbines, and other key manufacturing areas left in place into the 2030s as well. And then some key tweaks that were made to the code, like transferability, that make it easier for those tax credits to be utilized by a broader stake of investors and corporate entities to push them forward. And so the reason I kind of lay out these like kind of four big bills, which I would say are the most consequential from a clean energy and innovation standpoint, is to show that there was a lot more consensus in this technology space. You know, these two, Energy Act, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, big bipartisan initiatives, over the half of the Republican conference on board on the infrastructure bill, majority of Republican and Democratic conferences on the Energy Act. You've got these two partisan bills that had moved forward when one party were in majority, but there's a lot more overlap than you would think, particularly when it comes to technology policy. And so you've got a recipe of RD&D, early commercial deployment and commercial scale up kind of in place well into the back end of this decade that I think is an exciting opportunity, especially in this new economic moment where we're dealing with rising demand. And so what I would say is there is more excitement, interest, and when we talk to investors, than you would see reading many of the headlines. And ClearPath is really oriented on trying to unlock that private sector investment with targeted public sector investment and policies, whether it's permitting reform and regulatory reform, whether it's concerted RD&D programs where the DOE is working with innovators in our country forward, or tax incentives that allow these to get financed. There's a huge opportunity here to both grow American generation, American manufacturing, and reduce emissions. Both parties are wrestling with this rising demand issue today. We went through 2 decades effectively of single digit or stagnant electricity demand. And so we're all fighting over the same pie, to oversimplify it, right? Now that we have a growing pie, there's immense opportunity to drive more investment into this space, bring new technology forward, grow generation, modernize our grid, all things that I think are going to be no regrets from an affordability standpoint, from a reliability standpoint, and for our low carbon future. And so we continue to try to find that middle ground of where is there politically feasible policy, policy that drives our economic future, and policy that drives our low carbon future. These are a few areas just over the next couple of years where we see a lot of bipartisan consensus as we talk to Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill. Geothermal, really exciting technology area. Nuclear. In some of the manufacturing sectors like cement, concrete, asphalt, steel, chemicals, we're doing a lot of the same type of production that we've done for decades. Many policymakers are working with industry closely to try to find exciting pathways to make cement, for example, in a lower carbon way, catalyze the deployment, give us a product with better performance standards. I think one underappreciated point in this data center surge that we have at the moment is it's going to be the single largest driver of increase in cement demand. We need products that can cure faster, that are more resilient, that need updates. And so there's a big opportunity on that front. On the build here side, regulatory modernization, I think, is the single largest opportunity before Congress this year. We saw a big permit reform package get across the U.S. House before the holidays. It had bipartisan support. And in the Senate, there are ongoing negotiations on trying to find a path forward that makes it easier to build in this country, gives us a regulatory system that doesn't just serve us today in this political moment, but for the next decade. And we are cautiously optimistic that policymakers are to come together because it's a meeting of multiple motivations, right? Both parties are trying to figure out how they're going to deal with potentially an affordability and reliability crisis with rising demand. We're increasingly concerned about the fragility of our grid and the need for grid modernization. We've seen the political weaponization of permitting in this administration and in previous administrations that I think a lot of policymakers, Republicans and Democrats, would like to come together and kind of neutralize, put some of this stuff more on, I don't want to call it autopilot, but more in an evidence-based and fact-based permitting structure, a technology-agnostic approach. And in the end, I think there's a significant need to foster more investment in our grid, whether it's new transmission, tackling major struggles with the U.S. electricity markets related to interconnection. And I think this leads to an opportunity to really get a big bipartisan package done. And then even on the sell globally side, we're seeing a lot of activity under the radar. Towards the end of the calendar year, you probably saw more headlines on the administration pulling out of international multilateral compacts. But something you didn't see a whole lot of headlines on were the significant bipartisan reauthorization of the Development Finance Corporation, and which is our single largest tool to be used for development finance abroad as a U.S. tool. The cap was increased significantly, eligibility of what countries you could invest in. A broader focus on energy got done. It's something that both the Biden and the Trump administration had been fighting for, reforms for this area for over 5 or 6 years. This Congress, the U.S. Congress is going to have to reauthorize the Export-Import Bank, another important tool in the global footprint as we try to promote U.S. technologies and investments abroad. You're seeing folks want to find new ways to develop security compacts and bilateral relationships between the U.S. and other partners to catalyze critical mineral deployment and development. Critical minerals that we're going to need for a clean energy transition for many of the technology in the Bay. And so there are a lot of these things that are under the radar, are never going to make it kind of in the initial headlines of the story that you're seeing in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post, but are getting done and could have a significant impact to our low carbon future. And so I remain optimistic. That is why ClearPath exists. In the end, we want to cut through the political noise and find bipartisan consensus. And I think there's big opportunities in this sector and in the climate space as we look to drive forward an affordable, reliable, and lower carbon future, not only for the U.S., but for the globe.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. You want to take a seat?
Yeah, absolutely.
Start peppering you with questions.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
So thank you for those opening remarks. I'm going to start kind of near term and then pivot a little bit later to sort of longer term, how we think about both the mix of policy and politics in the energy and climate space. So you talked a lot about innovation. You also talked about the importance of not picking winners, trying to be technology neutral. Early in the innovation pipeline, though, you almost by design, we have to sort of pick a technology. We're going to
Yeah.
do a demonstration project for the next generation nuclear facility, or we're going to test out enhanced geothermal, and it ends up being very specific. In fact, your list there was kind of a list of technologies on that innovate stage. So help me understand how you think about sort of where there's bipartisan support uh, across the kind of pipeline that we go from developing and testing the technologies where the nature of those projects funded by, say, the science office at DOE or what have
Hmm.
you is technology specific to eventually creating the kind of policy that interacts with the market to get deployment, to get commercialization. That one might say we want to just let the market decide, as you noted, let the market decide, let consumers decide what they want. We want to give them that kind of suite of technologies that may meet these different objectives we have for energy. We want it clean, we want it firm, we want it cheap. Um, how do we think about what's the right sort of continuum of policies to
Hmm.
deliver on that? And where is that kind of what you see as the bipartisan sweet spot for that policy?
Yeah. At a very high level, I would say there is 90% consensus that we want technologies that are affordable, reliable, enable economic growth, and are better for the environment. In the end, people want a lower emissions future. They want to reduce environmental impact of economic growth. And so, as policymakers come together, whether it's because of their parochial interest from a particular state where an industry is prevalent, or from a national security perspective, they see this technology as exciting or necessary for our long-term future. You see people coming together and finding pockets, right? You get unconventional partners. You get Shelley Moore Capito, a U.S. senator from West Virginia, heavy coal state, and Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democratic senator from Rhode Island, who is probably the one of the largest climate hawks in all of the U.S. government, coming together and driving forward on policy on heavy industry decarbonization, American manufacturing competitiveness, are going to be essential to that permitting deal that I think is going to come together here over the next 6 months. Because in the end, they're looking at this bigger picture and the economic opportunity and environmental opportunity before for the country. And so it's finding those pockets of members where they have a local interest, a substantive interest in finding that recipe, right? And so what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years is pretty broad agreement. Like the government can play an important role in the investment in the research and development. And some of these big cost share programs, no doubt, I don't want to minimize that some of the Infrastructure and Jobs Act cost share programs got scaled back, but over half of them left in place moving over the last year that allow companies to come and compete, right? And so the Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program is an interesting case study, and we do a lot more than nuclear. I'm sorry, I'm leaning into nuclear on this front, but when this multi-billion-dollar demo program came in place, the reactor companies are actually competitive for federal billions of federal dollars of cost share had to have off-takers lined up, utility partners, investors, or early stage investors that showed that, like, if they showed commercial viability of this technology, that there was a case to be made for project 2, 3, 4, 5. And that's what you're kind of seeing across the clean tech spectrum, right? Like in the end, the market is kind of deciding who is a viable competitor in this space because it's tied to who you can attract private capital from, what off takers you have, what customers. And you're seeing the risk appetite change significantly in this rising demand scenario. So X Energy is partnering with Amazon on their high temperature gas reactor. Kairos, another advanced reactor design, is in partnership with Google. Fervo, an enhanced geothermal system company, is also in partnership with Google. The hyperscalers are kind of driving a little bit of this catalyzation of new technology that I think is going to be really critical moving forward.
So we've got this period of growing demand in the power sector. Certainly, we talked about it in the context of data centers. We know it's also being driven in part by electrification of transport, and to some degree, maybe it'll grow more in the future, electrification of building heating. Uh, A big challenge we face, though, is getting the infrastructure permitted and sited. That you can have a technology that looks relatively cheap, in terms of like, here's what it's going to cost to actually put cement and steel in the ground and build a new power plant. But then there are these other costs, sometimes they are called soft costs, of working through the process and the framework.
Yeah.
And you talk some about NEPA reform and permitting reform that moved through the House. Um, right now, we're seeing a bit of a pushback from Senate Democrats on this.
Yep.
Help us understand sort of what are some of their concerns about how to sort of craft a reform to permitting authority when thinking about how they would delegate that authority to the executive branch, and what may be a way to try to manage that politically over the course of this year.
Mm-hmm. Well, first I'll say, in my near 20 years in DC, there's never been as much bipartisan interest in this type of regulatory reform. In the end, Republicans and Democrats coming together because they see one, a recognition that the current system is broken, two, the economic imperative to build faster here, and three, the environmental benefit of moving forward more low carbon technologies as you build forward. Um, and that is why you saw a deal near the finish line last Congress, that was NEPA reform, judicial review, investment in new American transmission, and a handful of other like kind of targeted technology reforms that just didn't quite get over the finish line. And now here in this Congress, policymakers wanted to pick up that, expand on it, grow it, and really lean into this moment where we need to build faster US. There is a trust deficit in DC at the moment. And this is in every area, but particularly in the clean energy area. And so you mentioned a few of the key Senate Democratic leaders kind of pull away from negotiations here before Christmas, right after the Trump administration had retroactively removed permits from some offshore wind and other renewable projects in the US. And we've had some meetings with Republican senators just in the last couple of weeks. And every single one of them have said, we've got to move out of these technology wars. We need a regulatory system that's technology agnostic, that's predictable, that investors can believe in, that project developers can believe in. And you have to have confidence that once a permit is issued, like you can just move forward, right? And so that's going to be an essential piece of this deal. Behind the scenes, there's already a lot of staff negotiations on this. It was a heavy focus on the House side, too. If they had been able to come to an agreement on it at the end, I think you probably would have gotten 60, 70 House Democrats rather than a little over a dozen on the House bill. But I think there's a general recognition that we've got to take a little bit of the subjective, political subjectiveness out of the system.
Now, when we think about the challenges in siting infrastructure, it's not just federal law that matters. In many cases, state law and even local considerations. There's also issues about, like, if we're going to build it, how are we going to allocate the cost across the rate base when we build this infrastructure, something that is becoming all the more poignant right now when people think about building infrastructure to serve specific data centers as they are coming online or being planned. What is the appetite? This is something that when I was in government, we talked about some, and there wasn't much political appetite for anything where the federal government would usurp powers that have been vested with the states or the localities. And one can imagine, I think, on both the left and the right, there would be some on both sides of the aisle who don't want to give up some of the voice under their state or local process. Do you see any interest in trying to have some kind of federal authorities displace those authorities that are currently at the state level?
There is this constant friction between federalism and a need to have a national strategy here, particularly as you talk about regional infrastructure. And so you're seeing some significant consensus both on transmission and grid infrastructure, and on the pipeline side, right? So just to give you a couple examples, I mean, it is clear that the ability to drive investment in a new transmission is broken. We have transmission projects in this country who are almost as old as 21 in the project development cycle, right? There's a transmission project out west, or kind of interconnecting Idaho, Oregon, California, that is just about to hit the 21 years of like permit and regulatory process. That's not a functional, right? We see this in the pipeline side, and particularly here in the Northeast. New York has used the Clean Water Act to oppose some gas pipelines that would connect them into the Pennsylvania region, and that's led to what was it? And that Clean Water Act tool actually could have a major impact on transmission development as well, as we get into some of these projects. And so, I think you're seeing Republicans and Democrats say we have federal structure for a reason, and there are ways that these tools are being used somewhat arbitrarily to block projects that aren't necessarily based on their environmental attributes. And so I think you're going to see the federal government and Congress step in a few of these areas, whereas a handful other we want to be like, okay, states, you need to take matters into your own hand, especially states that want to lean into, and that could be a competitive advantage for them.
So you've talked some in your talk and just now about how we think about competitiveness. If anything, it seems like that has animated, if you will, at the executive branch in a bipartisan way over the last half dozen years about needing to elevate U.S. competitiveness in the energy space, taking very different approaches,
Yeah.
both in terms of tools and priorities, but both believe in the importance of energy and how to establish, I guess we can use the current parlance, dominance in energy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in a sense, there's this kind of concern about China's lead. And there are some about what you described in terms of like how we need to have a more concerted program in developing these technologies. I sometimes joke in my class that like, more and more the world is now trying to figure out what was the Chinese model 10, 15 years ago, how they really then got ahead on solar. And some countries are trying to, including the US, trying to follow suit, perhaps in different technologies, trying to follow suit in doing that. How does this concern about American competitiveness uh, influence the politics about what's viable on energy policy?
Mm-hmm. It has dramatically shifted the policy conversation in Washington, D.C. over the last 3 or 4 years. Um, there is a significant interest in industrial policy and wanting to make investments in sectors that are key. I think you're seeing it. You saw that in the Biden administration with big investments from the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, some of the debates on the IRA tax credits, for example, the EV credit, a major push on domestic content and other requirements that were aimed at like catalyzing domestic supply chains. You're seeing it from the Trump administration as well, whether it's Project Gemini, which is their big AI initiative, and where they're trying to drive federal dollars to bring new AI technologies forward. You're seeing it in critical minerals, where the U.S. government has gone as far as taking equity stakes in a handful of companies where there's significant Chinese exposure. There is slightly more interest in things like price collars, price floors, something that certainly you wouldn't have been hearing from Republican administrations a decade ago, the George W. Bush administration, for example. But a bit of a recognition that, unfortunately, a pure laissez-faire approach is not going to work, particularly in some of these key sectors where the Chinese or other foreign competitors do things that manipulate the market. And so this populism in both parties is driving the kind of consensus that I was laying out there, right? Like a recognition that private sector dollars should be in the RD&D, that we need to be putting in the later stage part, right? Chips and Science Act, which was a bill that I didn't mention out there. You're seeing um, both the Biden administration and the Trump administration trying to take some credit for some of the key investments that have been made in the back end of the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration is trying to carry forward. And so it really presents an interesting paradigm here. And I think it's going to be illustrative of what the future of energy and climate policy can be over the next decade, because I don't think this populism is going away. And I don't think this national security concern is going away. And you're seeing it even in the major party candidates who are already crazily starting to gear up like presidential campaigns 3 years out.
So let's think a little bit longer term now. In one of my classes, when I talk about like if you want to drive reduction in emissions, there's basically three ways you could do it. You could subsidize the clean stuff. You can put a price on the dirty stuff, like through a carbon tax or cap and trade. The subsidies in the U.S. we've done primarily through tax credits.
Yep.
Or you could do regulations that sort of prescribe either specific technologies or prescribe certain performance. For example, a lot of states have renewable portfolio standards. Um, right now we don't have the fiscal space for the kind of aggressive subsidy program like we had in the IRA. I mean, things may change over the next few years. And I'll ask Jim Stock if I should be optimistic about the potential for there to be fiscal space in the future, but I'm not sure he's going to, I'm pretty sure he's actually going to say no, Joe, there's not. Um, we have, under at least current statutory authorities, a lot of questions about how aggressive the regulator can be given recent Supreme Court rulings. So there's a question about how much we can do through regulation, at least under current law. Um, you can tell me very quickly, you could just say, no, Joe, what the politics are on a carbon tax. But all that is to say, if I want to think about a policy in the future that's going to drive faster deployment of clean energy technology, building on the innovation we're supporting now, trying to accelerate quickly the build out in this space to meet the rising demand in the power sector and elsewhere, what do you see as potentially a bipartisan policy tool or toolkit that would resonate 5 years or more into the future to deliver on that kind of rapid clean energy deployment and reduction in emissions?
ClearPath's thesis has always been we have to drive down the cost of clean energy and lower carbon options rather than tax or increase the cost of the emitting sources. And so I think if a carbon tax was going to happen, it would have happened at the IRA moment, and there wasn't political viability there. It would have been reconciliation compliant, and it really had no traction. And that is why you've seen incentive policy and really take off on both sides, right? Like Republicans, left in place a bunch of these big incentives after their big reconciliation bill because they saw it as an imperative to invest in these technologies, and it's why Democrats ultimately pivoted to a carrots policy for the Inflation Reduction Act. Um, as we get into the long run, right? Like I expect that we're going to benefit from this innovation boom. We're going to benefit from the major big demo programs that have come in place, the commercial incentives to revitalization, and we're going to kind of get the last squeeze we can get out of that kind of thing. And we're going to figure out, all right, I believe it's probably sector by sector policies, but how do we get to those deeper decarbonization levels in each sector? And to your point on the regulatory paradigm, like I think it could change later down the road, but recent Supreme Court rulings and kind of lessons learned, the back and forth, even just on things like tailpipe rules, for example, have shown those are not the politically durable solutions that they're going to go across political administrations. And so I think this drive down to secure our supply chains, to drive down the early commercial cost of these new technologies is the short to medium range, and then these sector specific targeted initiatives that drive us to an affordable, deeper decarbonization level is ultimately what the long term is.
Okay. Let me ask one more question, then I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience. You mentioned the 2020 energy bill as being important for a number of the things that it did, but also how it set the stage for the 2021 infrastructure bill.
Yeah.
And you also referenced the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act, which when I was in the government in 2009, had the statutory authorities that served as the basis for spending in the Recovery Act of February 2009, where we spent a lot of resources in clean energy. Both those went through this thing that seems more and more rare in Congress these days called regular order.
Yep.
Right. So it's actually going through a committee process. It is bringing in legislative proposals. It's going through hearings and markups in the committee, getting something that can pass through committee. Sometimes it's party line, which means like where you used to work on the Senate, very close, like one vote difference. But sometimes, and especially, there has historically been this kind of relationship on the Energy Committee to try to find a bipartisan path forward. Do you think that we're going to see potentially a return to regular order on one or two sides of Capitol Hill to help us sort of think through what sort of more comprehensive energy and climate policy could be down the line?
Not in the near term. Okay. In the end, everything is moving on a larger vehicle, right? Like I mentioned, the Development Finance Corporation reauthorization, it got attached to the annual defense bill that they have to do every year. I think this big permitting package maybe moves standalone, but more likely gets tacked on to a surface transportation reauthorization or an end-of-year budget deal. And that's not to say that regular order doesn't happen, right? Like there are a lot of like committee proceedings and legislative work that lays the foundation for it to get across the finish line in a bigger package. But in the end, and especially in these very narrow majorities, which we've frankly lived in over the last decade, um, you have a really limited chance to move vehicles through the legislative bills through the legislative process.
Okay, I'll be patient. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. Bill and then Jim.
So this was terrific. I want to ask a question which is related to Joe's going. It's a question about scale. So we go back a few years, and Bill Gates, the great philosopher, said, "What do we need? We need a miracle." And by that, I interpreted, and I think many people, we need a technology innovation which is so inexpensive that Nigeria adopts it. And if we can't get there, then we're not going to be able to address these problems, particularly climate problems. And that seems to be an enormous challenge. Everything you say that you're doing sounds like a good idea, but to me, it sounds like small beans compared to the big problem, because we just can't get to that threshold where it's going to be cheap enough for Nigeria to do it instead. What is the scale story in your vision here?
I mean, it's why we take a broad technology approach. Like we work a lot on nuclear. I think nuclear is a great fit for some countries. Like it's not going to be a fit for every region in this country, for example. And so, in the end, like we've got to, and Mr. Gates has always talked about the green premium, right? Like how do you bridge the gap between commercial viability and that green premium? And it's why we take a portfolio approach, right? Like it's why we're starting to work a little more on fusion. I still have some skepticism on fusion and commercial scale up long term, but there's enough private sector activity and excitement and entrepreneurial progress there that I think it's worth a bet, right? And I think we're still at that bet stage. And over the next decade, I think we're going to see a few key technologies really emerge, and we're going to continue to see direct investment in wind and solar and massive breakthroughs on the energy storage side that allows us to utilize those tools not only here but globally.
Okay, we'll go to Jim, but I'm going to follow up on this here. So we have a diverse
Yeah.
portfolio. How big is this portfolio? Like, how much money do we need to put in? And what, at the end of the day, if we think that I speculate we don't have much fiscal space, we don't have, and it's not just, the egghead saying, we've got these constraints. Politically, there are the constraints now in terms of federal spending. You mentioned the hyperscalers. They're putting real money into some of these advanced technologies. How should we think about what's going to be the scale of the portfolio and who's paying for it?
Yeah. The government side of it should be public-private partnerships that bring things to the kind of investable and takeoff range, right? And then I think the practical reality is we're going to have to unlock trillions of dollars of private sector investment. I think there's a major economic opportunity there, but like there are limits to public sector dollars, like leading to the scale up that we know that we need to reach deep decarbonization goals. And so that's why the public dollars, particularly public US dollars, which have gone up significantly over the last decade, but still not enough, like are still going to have to be spread like relatively thin and aimed at catalyzing and really getting technology to the point where an Amazon or a Microsoft or a Google or a Nucor, the largest steel producer in the US, is willing to make a bigger bet on them. And that's what we saw, for example, in the advanced reactor space, right? Like you put a handful of billions of dollars behind these leading designs, you're going to get the first one built. Microsoft, Amazon were not involved in those originally. So the X Energy one was with Dow, and the TerraPower one with Berkshire Hathaway or PacifiCorp. But now that they've started to move through the process, they're further in licensing. You're now seeing the hyperscalers move forward. Fervo, another great example, the enhanced geothermal system, like they had a pilot project in Utah. Now you're seeing a wave of new PPAs and agreements because they've been able to prove their viability. And so we think about scarce public dollars. It's how do we do these like projects 1 through 5, for the lack of a better way of putting it, and show the market like these are investable and are a massive economic opportunity. Because I do have high skepticism on the globe as a whole putting together the public sector resources to meet the climate challenge.
Jim.
my question follows up directly on that last bit, which is really trying to think about what's the most effective innovation policy that we actually can have. Like, how should we implement this? So, for all the furvos and so forth, you can think about other challenges with each of the various programs. The DOE Loan to Office program has had, of course, important successes, but it's been hamstrung in a number of ways. And more recently, a lot of those loans have been pulled back, and sort of the redirection of resources. So it's subject to politics, of course, because it's an agency. Standards like the renewable fuel standard was supposed to drive second generation cellulosic biofuels. That didn't really happen. So I think we have a mixed track record. The one that I would point to, there's a spectacular success, was Operation Warp Speed, which really created the new vaccine using new technologies. What's in your sense, like, what's the efficient structure? If you could say, given our vicissitudes and given our challenges, how should we set up an innovation program for clean energy in the United States?
That's a challenge. Efficiency and politically viable aren't necessarily the same thing, right? But to your point, either on Operation Warp Speed or other key innovations that we've seen, like the federal government can play a role in the early stage research and development. It can play a role in the market, the later stage market pull, right? So, for example, we're working on a cement policy at the moment, and it's aimed at providing an advanced market commitment to these lower carbon cement producers, and so allowing state DOTs and federal highway dollars to be used for that type of product. You're seeing it in the critical mineral space, right, where the U.S. government is doing an initial backstop. You're seeing it in nuclear fuels as well. You're doing like a kind of an advanced market commitment there. So those are areas where I think you can use limited government resources to do that kind of last pull. Because I think we are doing, and we're making good progress on the early stage stuff, the research and develop, get out of the lab, initial commercial deployment. I think where we're really struggling is that last market pull. In the power sector, you're seeing it because the hyperscalers it's in their economic interest to want to diversify their scaled energy resources. But in some of these other areas and low carbon products, you're going to need that vehicle to kind of pull the initial deployment out. And I think the U.S. is uniquely positioned to do that. And I think we're seeing global market signals out there. EU policy, for example, means if we double down on it, we're going to have better access into those global markets.
Okay.
Thank you for taking the time. My name is Brian, first year public policy student here. I'm curious if you've heard from legislators, or if you are trying to push on to legislators that piece on competition and achieving climate goals more quickly. For example, Chinese EVs are much lower cost than what we have here. Have you been talking about that at all? Kind of what technologies, is it maybe a good opportunity to let American competitiveness not be the number one goal and kind of bring in external tech?
Yeah, the climate goals conversation is not motivating a lot of this policy action. The competitiveness is. And I think that's why you're seeing Republicans and Democrats want to more aggressively put public sector resources behind some of these areas, because they see the concern. The AI race, whether that means chips, whether it's on compute. What I would argue the long pole attempt for them is access to power. China's way ahead of us. They build faster. They're putting the business behind, but they are behind in the chips technology areas. But we run this risk of not dealing with this long pole and squandering the kind of entrepreneurial advantage that we have at this moment. I think you're seeing that in vehicles, right? Like, even some of the tax credits that were preserved. You saw Republicans in Congress say, we want to leave the solar manufacturing credit in place because we think there's a major vulnerability that we're having to source that manufacturing predominantly from China. And so they see both the economic opportunity and that competition point. So I would say the economic and the national security point are what are motivating action in a more bipartisan way at the moment.
In a previous generation, U.S. automakers would go into China by entering into a joint venture with a Chinese company. Could we see a Chinese EV manufacturer enter into a joint venture with a U.S. car company and build here in the U.S.?
No, not in this environment. In fact, Republicans and Democrats have gone out of their way to put new policy in place to prohibit that. So the Biden administration rules on some of the big IIJA dollars coming forward had some strict foreign entities of concern requirements. The tax credits that remain post the reconciliation bill in July kind of double down on those. And from a climate perspective, if you think of it as pure macro, right, we just want the lowest cost solutions in the market. You've seen Democratic and Republican policymakers say we're not willing to sacrifice that kind of reliance on the global market purely on cost.
Right. So it's this challenge of like, we want it cheaper, we want it cleaner, we want it reliable, we also want it to address our national security objectives as well. We have a lot of objectives in this space.
Yes.
Which means policy that can survive politically is probably not first best we draw up on the chalkboard in the ivory tower.
Exactly right.
Okay. David.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's great to have you here and have this conversation so timely and important. I'm David Cash. I lead the Climate Action Accelerator. That's part of the Salata Institute. So here's a politics question. So when IRA was developed and then implemented, there was definitely a notion that investments were going to be made everywhere, blue states, red districts, et cetera. And in fact, depending on what program, 70 to 80% of IRA funds went to red districts. And I think the calculation was, if the investments are made there, it'll be politically really difficult to go backwards. And that proved not to be true. So similar to Joe's question, do you see a future in which that kind of standard political economy calculus, that is federal investments, not on the tax side, but on the investment side, will be robust and durable in the kind of spaces that you're talking about? Like, was this a blip, or will we go back to what seemed normal?
I would argue that it actually didn't prove out to not be true. I don't think that the resources got deployed as fast as they could have been. I think if this political moment had happened 2 years later, like, it would have been even harder to. And then we've got some key case points where that still materialized. And I'd say solar manufacturing is maybe one of the best examples. The president was actively against wind and solar subsidies, attacking them pretty regularly during the reconciliation put. We've also seen that on the permitting side. On the manufacturing side, you saw Republican members, particularly Republican members in places like Ohio and in Georgia, preserve the manufacturing credit from the very beginning of the process, even in the most the furthest repeal scenario that came out of the House initially. The solar manufacturing credits stayed in place because you had Republican policymakers who had those investments in red states fighting for them. And we saw that in other technologies too, in geothermal, in nuclear, and energy storage, and hydro and critical minerals. The Western members really leaned in. And we've seen that stay true on the major DOE dollars too. The administration proposed to cut certain agreements. For example, the director of capture hubs in Louisiana. You saw the Republican governor of Louisiana, both Republican senators and the Republican Speaker of the House say, we support these projects, and the DOE reversed course on it. And so I think we just didn't see it at the scale that folks had hoped because of the timeframes. But I think that theory of change remains valid.
Thank you. I'm Karen Clopton. I was the Chief Administrative Law Judge for 10 years for the California Public Utilities Commission. During that time, of course, I was very involved in decommissioning nuclear power plants. So I'm listening to a fiction that nuclear power is clean. We currently have 88,000 metric tons of radioactive waste that has not been addressed. So I have a few questions, so that's one of them. The other one is you began your presentation about the current demand. Well, the demand is artificially driven by the artificial movement of a software tool that people are calling AI. And so, just as an example, when Google launched Gemini, in their press release, they admit that it's only 72% accurate. So would you buy a vacuum cleaner that only worked 72% of the time and tripled your utility bills every month? Which brings me to the third aspect, and that is about the ratepayers. The ratepayers in these grids, granted, let's look at New Jersey as well as Virginia, they are suffering. Their bills are very, very high. And what are they paying? They are not paying for themselves. They're paying for an actual not fully baked technology tool that is not helping them at all. This is not only impacting the grid, but it's also impacting their water resources as well as other aspects. Which brings me to the last thing I'll just mention.
You got a lot of questions here.
I do.
Okay, so quickly on the last one.
The last one has to do with what you think is advanced nuclear technology. Are you talking about SMRs, which have been shown through studies at both Stanford and in British Columbia that SMRs actually create more radioactive waste than conventional nuclear reactors?
Why don't I start with the nuclear waste combo? One, we're talking about both SMRs and advanced reactors, so non-light water designs. Many of those designs produce significantly less waste. Some of them can even burn existing waste, and we've already seen the DOE and the labs demonstrate that. And so you can reduce the amount of waste, and the remaining waste significantly less, just has a longer life, right? So we'll still have to deal with it. I would argue that no technology is purely clean if you're using the definition that you're laying out on nuclear waste. We've got byproducts from all types of technologies. We're still struggling to deal with the minerals needed from a variety of things, and gas, CCS. Obviously, we're having to deal with CO2. Like every technology has a trade-off. We are storing existing nuclear fuel in a very safe way on sites that could be done for 100 years. I'm of the belief that we do need a multi-site long-term repository story, but I don't think that is a limiter to a nuclear scale-up globally. I think you and I just have a fundamental disagreement on on nuclear there. On your AI point, I think that consumer dynamic is going to be one of the most significant to wrestle with over the next 2 years. And you're already seeing this start to become an election issue. No doubt about it. Virginia ratepayers are effectively paying for a national build out of the infrastructure needed for data centers and AI. I think I have a much more bullish view on the role that AI is going to play in improving the lives of the general consumer as a whole. But that affordability issue is going to be tough. You're already seeing a handful of projects in certain regions get significant local pushback. And so there's going to be an inherent tension there for sure. But demand growth, well, no doubt, like the data center build out is driving some of the higher numbers there. I think we're more confident in the upward trajectory of demand because of increased electrification across the economy. That's not just talking about transportation. The concerted push to onshore more American manufacturing, and probably limitations of efficiency policy.
I mean, my sense is when looking at, especially over the last like 5-6 years, some of the forecasts of electricity demand over, say, the next 2 to 3 decades, we were looking at estimates that ranged significantly. We might double demand, we might quadruple demand, depending on how quickly we electrified transportation, electrified building heating, to what extent electricity could substitute into industry and high energy uses. What I think we're seeing with data centers is just like something we expected in the 30s is happening in the mid 20s. And so it's just, I mean, Professor Hogan may have thoughts on this, but like we expect to have to meet this demand. It just happened a little bit faster because of the kind of investment we're seeing in data centers. So
the other challenge I just flagged too is the retirement of generation assets that we have in this country. We are hitting like a breaking point. We're already seeing this in PJM as we see gigawatts of or retire. The existing nuclear fleet, like all, even with license extensions, are about meeting their end of life here by the mid 2030s or early 2040s. And so I have a lot of skepticism on the worry about an overbuild out to meet this moment, because there is a significant retirement of gigawatt scale assets that is scheduled over the next decade to 15 years that we're going to have to wrestle with as well. And that has potentially significant climate implications as well, especially if we're losing those zero carbon emitting nuclear plants and having to meet it with gas, unconstrained gas.
So we have more interest and investment going on in nuclear. You mentioned geothermal as well. ClearPath recently put out a report on geothermal and how to accelerate the build out in the US. I want to connect this back, though, to your point about how we think about engaging other countries. Mm-hmm. How do we think about producing and manufacturing or advancing the innovation necessary in these technologies to then bring them to a global market? I would say my perspective, at least, on the evolution of trade policies suggests a kind of fraying of economic relationships, a reduction in trust in the United States as a partner. How can the U.S. be effective in developing geothermal technology, nuclear technology, or some other technology that they can then bring to the rest of the world? And the rest of the world, I mean, even if it's cheap, we were just talking about China produces cheap cars.
Yep.
And for non-economic reasons, we don't want to bring them into the U.S. How do we think about a sort of a policy and a strategy for engaging other countries so that market's going to be open if we are able to develop these technologies so that they are lower cost, cleaner technologies?
Yeah. I mean, one, we can't build out these supply chains on our own. There are limitations to the resources that we have here in the U.S. And I'm not just talking about money. I'm talking about literally what's below our feet, right? And so I think it's why you've seen both the Biden administration and the Trump administration really prioritize bilateral agreements on the mineral side. But at a more macro level, you're seeing a little bit of these trade paradigms as well, where aggressive tariff policy combined with economic partnerships that are effectively trying to buy out your tariff risk keep coming to fruition, and that's not a long-term sustainable policy construct. And so I am optimistic by the agreement in both political parties on the desire to drive forward more of these financing policies, global financing policies, DFC, XM. We're never going to beat China at their own game, right? We're never going to out-subsidize China in the global marketplace, but countries do still want to partner with the U.S. As long as we're putting together deals that ultimately respect their sovereignty, allow them to move forward, and can bring resources to bear for the deployment. And I think that we see that in particular on nuclear, where folks are a little more concerned about the partnerships with the Russians and the Chinese, even though the Russians and Chinese will serve you a product, they'll build it for you, they'll employ it, they'll manage it. It means you also don't have control of
it. Before we wrap up, let me note that we'll meet again at noon next Monday. We'll be hosting Ethan Zindler of Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Finally, please join me in thanking Jeremy Harrell for his presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
And thank you all for attending.